loud? Okay.
Okay.
Down. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to do a 3-part series. I'm not sure, it's always like play a little bit by ear what happens in part 3, but I think we decided for sure parts 1 and 2 we'll do. We'll talk about Birchot Yaakov. We're kind of in like the zone of the parsha without really speaking about the parsha. How are you? I gave you 2. Amazing. Okay. If anyone, I have more source sheets here. If anyone needs or doesn't have, someone comes in, we can put them here. Okay. So let me just spread out here. Perfect. All right, so let's just take a look at our opening 2 psukim in source number 1, which are from the very end of Sefer Birchot. We're approaching Parshat Vayigash, but these psukim are from Parshat Vayechi, which is fine because we'll still be in our series when we get there. So we're kind of like, again, we're not specifically speaking about Parshat HaShavua, but we're a little bit in the zone of where our parshiot are. So if you look here in source number 1, this is a pretty well-known scene. Vayikra Yaakov el banav vayomer heyasfu va'agida lachem et asher yikra etchem ba'acharit hayamim. Yaakov says, come gather together and I'll tell you what will be in the end of days. Even though the Yikra is with an Aleph, most of the Mefarshim agree it just means Yikra with a Hey. It's an interesting discusussion, but we'll a little bit leave it aside for now. We'll go with the flow here with our Mefarshim and we'll say what will happen to you in the end of days. There we go. Pasuk bet, hikavtzu v'shimu b'nei Yaakov, assemble and listen, sons of Yaakov, v'shimu el Yisrael avichem. And listen to Yaakov, your father, Yisrael, your father. Okay, and then what ensues are a string of what we're calling in our title, Birchot Yaakov, blessings of Yaakov, to each of his children. It's sort of like the rest of the parak here. So before we get into any of the particular brachot, any of the particular messages that Yaakov charges his sons with, I wanted to start by asking, what's Yaakov's intent? Why is he gathering them together? What's his goal in gathering the sons together? What's his plan? What's his purpose? What is he, intending to use this time for? What kind of messages is he going to be conveying? And we'll see a bunch of different approaches, and then we'll land on one a little bit towards the end of tonight, and we'll stick with that approach for tonight, and then we'll see what happens next week. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So we'll start in source number 2 with the approach of Rabbeinu Bechaye. And Rabbeinu Bechaye starts us off and he says, Amru b'midrash, Hitchil Yaakov birchato mimakom shepasak Yitzchak aviv levarechoto. That Yaakov is just picking up where Yitzchak left off. Yitzchak, of course, we know, famous scene, blesses his 2 sons, Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov comes in, he steals, that's a whole different topic for another time. Everybody steals Esav's bracha, but Yitzchak had this intention to bless both of his children before he died. And Yaakov says, Rabbeinu Bechaye, quoting the Midrash, Yaakov's just picking up where Yitzchak left off. He's carrying on the tradition. Shene'emar, as the psukim say, Vayikra Yitzchak el Yaakov vayevarechoto. Yitzchak had called in Yaakov to bless him. And then the Midrash goes on and says, V'hitchil Moshe v'zot habracha mimakom shepasak Yaakov birchotav. After Yaakov blesses his children, who picks up the tradition next but Moshe, who blesses the tribes before his death, which is, again, probably an important part, maybe part 2 or 3 of our discussion, is looking at the brachot that Yaakov gives his children in comparison to the brachot that Moshe gives those tribes that have expanded from those original 12 children. Just as it's not really a side point, it's not really essential for this moment, but I'll say it now so I don't forget, is that the not just the Torah, Tanakh does something very interesting with the tribes. It treats the nature of each tribe based on the nature of the original son. So, Reuven was the Bechor who was petulant about losing his Bechorah. Therefore, of course, Datan and Aviram join Korach in his argument because the whole tribe of Reuven is like still a little bitter and resentful that they lost their Bechorah, right? So that's sort of like the way Tanakh deals with, even after Chumash times and we get into Nach times, the way Tanakh deals with the tribes is sort of always associating them back with the nature that, if we know it, of the original son. So the fact that Moshe gives these blessings, a bunch of years later after Yaakov gives them to his 12 children, there needs to be a comparison or a look at those 2 side by side, because again, the blessing to the tribe should reflect something of the blessing or the nature of the original son. So the blessing that Yaakov gave the original son. So Moshe is next to bless these tribes. And he picks up from where Yaakov left off. V'hitril David Sefer Tehillim ve'ashrei ha'ish. And David begins his whole work of Tehillim with the words Ashrei ha'ish. Mimakom shepasak Moshe birchotav, from exactly the point where Moshe's blessings left off. And Moshe ends with Ashrecha Yisrael mikamocha am noshav Hashem, right? Ashrecha Yisrael, praiseworthy are you, Israel. And David picks up Ashrei ha'ish, praiseworthy is the man, from the exact spot that Moshe left off. So the order, according to the Midrash, is Yitzchak starts this whole tradition of blessing his children. Yaakov picks it up. Moshe then picks it up generations later, and followed another bunch of generations later by David. And then the Rabbeinu Bechai just ends by saying, Ve'al zeh amar David, and this is why David has said in Tehillim, Mizkenim et ponin, I've gained more understanding than my elders, or I'm building on the work of my elders. Okay, so our first answer, and it's a little bit of a simple answer, and we'll build from here, is that this whole idea of gathering your children to bless them is a tradition started by Yitzchak, and it's a tradition that Yaakov thinks is a good one to perpetuate, to keep going. So he gathers his sons too. It's what his father did, and that's a pretty worthy reason. I know I can think of a lot of things I do just because that's what my parents did, and they did just because their parents did, and that's how traditions get started. And the Midrash, values that tradition and says that not only did Yaakov value Yitzchak's tradition, but Moshe comes along and values Yaakov's tradition, and then David comes along and values Moshe's tradition, and this concept of blessing the people, starting with Yitzchak blessing Yaakov himself. Okay, so it's an interesting idea. Sefaria. It's terrible, I know. It's like a whole nother life plan that somebody should do, is be a translator on Sefaria, if you know anyone. Every so often it's so bad that I actually change it. When I have time, I actually I'll go through my source sheets and go, I can't even use it. This one's it's bad, but sometimes it's not even usable. I apologize for the bad translation. Okay, so sort of one approach to what's Yaakov doing here by gathering his sons. He's continuing a tradition. Beautiful idea. Let's turn to a different approach, and that's the approach of Rashi, and we'll look at that in sources 3a and 3b. So this is a really well-known Rashi. We'll keep it in the shir, okay? But we'll move on from it also, because it's not exactly the direction we're going to go in, but you can't speak about Birchot Yaakov without speaking about this Rashi. So Rashi says, right, Yaakov gathers his sons, Bikesh legalot et haketz. Yaakov wants to reveal haketz, which Rashi is interpreting as Mashiach, right? Acharit hayamim. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the official capital T, capital E end of capital D days, right? The official end of days, Yemot HaMashiach. V'nistal kami menu shchina. But God doesn't want him to reveal to his sons what's going to happen in Yemot HaMashiach. So God quickly removes his Ruach HaKodesh from Yaakov. V'hitzchil omer dvarim acherim. Now, what I get when I read that Rashi is almost like he made this whole gathering. He's like, guys, I have big stuff to say. And then his mind goes blank, which has happened to me also. It's not Ruach HaKodesh, it's just, I don't know what, okay? But you can't have a gathering and then be like, oh, sorry, I forgot. You have to say something. So it seems like Rashi's suggesting, he's like, all right, well, while I have your attention, Ruvain, let me tell you something. So it's an interesting Rashi, because when it seems like the purpose of the gathering was not to bless his children, no intention whatsoever. But maybe he was going to do it after, it was going to be a side point, right? But his original intention was to reveal to them the secret of Yemot HaMashiach, right? That's always it's like my students, one of their favorite questions, and it's always a fun topic that has no answers, and it's like, you never feel stupider as a teacher when your students ask you about Mashiach and you're like, oh, I don't know, right? So there are obviously a lot of, there's interesting theories and good suggestions and educated guesses, but we don't really know. And that's because Hashem doesn't want us to know, clearly based on Rashi. It's actually, there's a midrash that the Malbim quotes in source 3b that supports this idea of Rashi, that Yaakov's intention was to reveal to them Yemot HaMashiach. And I really I like the medrash. It's not Rashi's original medrash that Malbim is quoting, but I like the medrash almost, as much or maybe more than I like the Rashi. So let's look in source 3b. Malbim says, Uva midrash, heyasfu me'aseret hashvatim v'hikadsu l'shevet Yehuda u'Binyamin. If you notice in our original psukim, back to source 1, there are 2 verbs used Yaakov uses that both represent the idea of assembling or gathering. First, he says, heyasfu, gather, come together. And then he says, hikabsu, assemble. And the Malbim's quoting a medrash that I couldn't find, so that's why I'm quoting it in the Malbim. Otherwise, full disclosure, I would have quoted the original medrash. But the medrash is picking up on the fact that Yaakov's using both words, heyasfu v'hikabsu, to gather his children. Why do we need? It's a classic Chumash question, right? Why does he need to say gather and assemble? Those seem to be synonymous in this context. And the Medrash suggests that it's a reference, an oblique reference, to the ingathering of exiles that we hope to experience in Yemot HaMashiach. That heyasfu is a reference to the 10 lost tribes, the Aseret HaShvatim, and hikabsu is a reference to Shevet Yehuda Ubinyamin, the 2 tribes of Malchut Yehuda that we represent, that went into Galut Babel. Let's see if we want to read more. Drusha said, go to the second line after the parentheses. Upirashti Sham, he's mentioned this in reference to a pasuk in Yeshayahu that also includes the 2 verbs, ve'asaf and yikabetz. She'aseret hashvatim einam mefuzarim rak nidachim, shelo noda mekomam utzrichim asifa. He explains the difference between la'asof, to gather, and likabetz, to gather. Okay, he explains the difference, the nuanced difference in Hebrew. And that nuanced difference, according to, there's a few actually, the Kli Yakar explains a different nuanced difference. If this line was our main topic, I guess we could go on all night. But the Malbim explains that the gathering is min hachutz el hapnim, someone who's on the outside, and you gather them in, you bring them in. The Shevet Yehuda uBinyamin hem nefutzim b'arba kanfot haaretz ve'inam nidachim ki noda mekomam, meaning the 10 tribes are lost, so we have to like gather them from some unknown outside location and bring them back. Whereas the 2 tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin, we're not lost, we're here, we're just scattered. And so there's a gathering of lost objects where you have to go find them, and then there's a collecting of scattered objects where you know exactly where they are, you just have to bring them to one place. And that's just an interesting little side piece of the Malbim where he explains that based on looking at the actual Rashi's drash of Yaakov wanting to reveal the end of days is a little out there in terms of what Yaakov's really doing. It's definitely not the pshat. But Malbim says, well, I have another medrash for you, which does cling closely to the pshat of the psukim, where we have those 2 verbs, heyasfu and hikabsu. And because we have those 2 verbs, that his second midrash quoted by the Malbim says, there is some subtle reference there to the idea of the ingathering of exiles that we'll experience in Yemot HaMashiach. So just like a little plug for Rashi's answer, it's a little out there, but it's not as out there as we may have thought. Okay, so our second approach is that he really wasn't planning on gathering his children together for any sort of blessing. But once he has them there, and now his mind is a blank because God emptied it, he's going to use his time, and he's going to, how often do you have your 12 grown kids, you know, at home at the foot of your bed? Like, it's a great opportunity to, you know, tell them how you feel about them. Okay, so that's our second approach. So approach number 1, carrying on a tradition. Approach number 2, no intention whatsoever to bless them, is just seizing the opportunity. Our third approach is going to be offered in source 4. I wish the approaches lined up with the numbers, I'm sorry, but is offered by the Ibn Ezra in source 4. So the Ibn Ezra says, Et asher yikra etchem, diber hanavi la'atid. It's not really a blessing per se, but Yaakov's telling them, he's a Navi, he's got this prophetic ability. We just saw Hashem, according to Rashi, took it away, right? Ibn Ezra says, no, God didn't take anything away. Yaakov is a Navi, he has prophecy, and he's using that prophecy to tell them what's going to happen in the future. V'ta'u ha'omrim shehem birchot. Anyone who says these are blessings, sorry for my title, Birchot Yaakov, so anyone who says that these are blessings is wrong. Ba'avur shematzu basof vayevarechotam. It does say later that he blesses them, but in the section of psukim that comprise the section of blessings as we read it, v'ayeh birchat Ruvain v'Shimon v'Levi. It's not really a great blessing. Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi, which is what we're going to focus on towards the end of tonight, they don't actually get, if that's a blessing, I wouldn't want to see a curse, okay? It's not a good, a blessing has a good connotation. I'm giving you a positive message, something I wish for you. That's a good thing to happen. And Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi, as we're going to look at momentarily, they don't get blessings. So we'd be hard-pressed to call what Yaakov does here blessings. Al derech hanavua amar zot, asher diber lahem avihem. Right? Amar, vizot asher diber lahem avihem. Sorry, I read that wrong. So he receives nevuah about each of his children, and this is what he conveys to them in this section. Ve'achar kach beirachotam. And then later on, he blesses them. V'lo hizkir hakatuv habrachot. Those blessings, the actual brachot, are not mentioned in the Chumash. That's like, we don't need to know, right? Anything that's not in the Chumash, I guess we don't need to know, so we don't need to know. So I actually read something beautiful about this idea of Yaakov telling them something that's going to happen in their future based on et asher yikra etchem, which again we said is spelled wrong in the Torah, which obviously it's not a typo, but let's go with yikra, meaning yikra, will happen to you, even though that's not what the word actually says. I read something beautiful that what Yaakov's telling them are the things in their future that are going to be mikra, the things that are going to happen to them that are not in their control. He can't tell them the things that are going to happen within their control because that's free will, and that's not infringed upon by nevuah. But he's telling them et asher yikra, and there are going to be certain things that I kind of want you to know that are going to happen that are godly. They're not, not random mikra, but things that will happen that it's not about your choices. These are just like, definitive things in your future. So it's an interesting approach. So not blessings, but predictions of the future. Okay. So those are like the three. We're not rejecting them in any way, but those are the three approaches that we're not going to focus on. Okay. So tradition, beautiful answer. Yaakov really didn't plan to bless them, but has nothing else to say. Okay. And the idea that these aren't blessings at all, but predictions of the future, those are three options we're not going to focus on. We're going to focus on the fourth approach, which is the approach of the Abarbanel. And it's a long piece in Hebrew. We'll try to read through it, and we'll get to hopefully his point. And then we'll take a look at, just for tonight, just the first four blessings. Or I don't know if we can even call them blessings. I don't know what to say, right? But the first four of his sons, the messages, we'll call them the messages. So the Abarbanel, if you're familiar with his style, he asks 100,000 questions at once, and then he answers them one at a time. And you have to kind of like go back to, oh wait, what was the question? Okay. So in this case, we're jumping into his discussion of this perek into his second question, Hashe'ela habet. Okay, the second question Abarbanel has about our psukim, B'tachlit habrachot. Okay, that was our question. B'tachlit habrachot ha'ela b'chlal. What was the point of these blessings in general? Like, what was Yaakov's point? What was his goal? What was he doing? Why was he gathering his sons together? What was his goal in speaking to them? He says it's got to be one of four things. Okay, there are four possible goals that Yaakov may have had in gathering his sons together to bless them. Ola kulam. So it's either one of four, or two of four, or three of four, or four of four. But these are like the only four. He's going to say the four, and then he's going to say none of these are right. It's a fifth. I'm just getting like full disclosure. Okay. He says it's got to be one of these four, and then it's not. Okay. But typically one would read this section with one or more of these following four purposes in mind. Im shahayu b'derech bracha v'tfila l'shem kol hamavorachim sheyevarchem u'kmo shekatuv acharehem vayevarechotam ish asher kevirchato beirachotam. So one possibility is bracha. He's blessing them. V'im shahaya lahochichem al hamaasim hamagunim asher ra'a bahem. Number two, he's rebuking them. Okay, why do you call your kids? I mean, you need to have a family meeting. You're either going to tell them something, guys, we're going to Disney World. Bracha. Okay, guys, we have to keep this house cleaner. Okay, tochacha, like rebuke. This is why we all have family meetings. Okay, these are the four reasons. Okay, maybe it's rebuke. Predictions for the future of their descendants. That would be number three. I don't even have a contemporary equivalent because none of us are Nevi'im. When we have family meetings, we don't say like, well, maybe we do. Your children are going to speak to you the way you speak to me. Okay, it's one of those. Yeah, that's a classic. Okay. And the fourth possibility is to tell them something about their future stake and inheritance in the land of Israel. Okay, like we have this property. It's sort of like if you were having your family meeting, like I haven't told you, but we have this property. So these are the four reasons why Yaakov would hold a family meeting. So if we say that these are blessings, Yeah, works well for Yehuda, Dan, Asher, Yosef. Okay, a lot of them, the last set of names I mentioned, it's very, very hard pressed to call those brachot. He really gives them much more of a curse than a blessing. So it would be difficult to go with approach number one that these are blessings because we have more curses than we have blessings. If we say the purpose was rebuke, right? The ones that got cursed, well, maybe it's a rebuke. Well, then what about the good ones? They're not getting rebuked. Okay, so we can't say it's blessing because many of them are not blessed. And we can't say it's rebuke because many of them are not rebuked. They had more of the blessing type. And if we say it's option 3, that he's telling them something that will happen in the future, some of them it works. There's no future prediction for five of the tribes. Okay, well, maybe it's purpose 4 that we're really just telling them about their inheritance and their stake in the land of Israel. Like we see with Yehuda, right? He's told he's going to have a land that's abundant with grapes. Zvulun, you're going to be at the seashore. Great land for planting wheat, like amazing. Asher, you're going to do great. I felt like the 10 sons of Haman there. There's nothing to do with their nachal. Okay, so Barbanel says, remember those 4 options? We can't really call this a list of blessings. And we can't really call this a list of rebuke. And we can't really call this a list of future predictions. And we can't really call this a list of nachala. What are we going to do with this list? We don't know what it is, says the Abarbanel, and it's really bothersome. So what's the point? Like, what's Yaakov telling his sons here? I'm like a person in my brain, I like to categorize things. Like, oh, those things are all red. Okay, right? I'm not organized, God forbid, but in my head, I'm always trying to make the categories, okay? So for me, I'm reading these and I'm thinking, it's automatic, like, so this is a list of blessings? I can't come up with a category. And if Barbanel's in my same spot, he can't either. So now he's going to give us a 5th option, and that's going to be the one we go with for the next couple of minutes. The Omnam, 2nd paragraph. The kavanat ele hama'amarim vehabrachot da'ati noteh. He goes, in my opinion, here's what I'm thinking. Sheyakov be'et moto ratza leva'er me'ezeh mibanav yetzeh shevet hamelucha v'hamemshala bezaro. Yaakov, his whole goal here is to pick a winner, pick a leader, pick a king, okay? He's looking at his 12 sons, and he's saying, this is already a big family. It's going to get much bigger. He looks at his sons and he's like, okay, this is going to be, I saw it with Nevuah and I see it with common sense. It's going to be a big nation one day. And they're going to need leadership. Interesting that Yaakov worries about the jealousy amongst his sons at the end of his life. He didn't seem to worry about it so much at the beginning. But because he does not want there to be fighting after his death, which I think we all don't want our children to do, right? This old man at the time of his death saw which tribe is going to be the leadership tribe? Ubo melachim yamluchu, right? And from that tribe, kings would be coronated. Uba'avur zeh, and so asach chipus v'chakira b'chol echad mibanav. He does a little investigation of each of his sons. Basically, he's thinking out loud. And he's looking at each child and he's saying, so you're interesting because you're kind of impetuous. So it's not going to be you, right? And he goes through, and well, I don't want to give too much away, but he goes through and he thinks out loud about each of his children. And the thought process is this man / future shevet, which now is the time for us to remind ourselves of what I said before. The shevet is going to bear the character of the original man. Okay, is this shevet worthy of leadership? So he thinks out loud. Ruvain, let's see. We have to talk about Ruvain a little, and Yaakov's going to say no. Okay, and he's going to go through each of his sons, and he's going to identify that shevet which is going to be worthy of the malchut, which we already know without being a spoiler alert. It's going to be shevet Yehuda. V'lachein mipnei habechina hazot zachar bechol echad mibanav ha'am techunotehem be'atzmam u'pa'am ha'atid lavo al zaram. So sometimes he's saying a future thing that's going to happen to them, which either qualifies or disqualifies them for leadership. And sometimes he's saying something that sounds like a blessing. Yes, you're very good. And sometimes he says something that sounds like a curse. He's just describing them out loud. And sometimes the description is based on the nachala that they'll get. And sometimes it's based on a future event. And sometimes it's based on a positive character trait. And sometimes it's based on a negative character trait. And sometimes a multiple combination of those things. So if we're confused by what he seems to be saying, says the Abarbanel, his goal, if we can, make that goal concrete, if we can concretize that goal, is to figure them out a little bit. Let's think out loud and see, well, what's the nature of Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, da-da-da-da-da, and let's see which one or ones have potential to go further as leaders. Lo letachlit habracha, the purpose though is not to bless them. V'lo letachlit hatochacha, the purpose is not to rebuke them. V'lo lahagid ha'atidot, not to tell the future. V'lo lesaper ma'alatam ba'aretz, and not to say something nice about their future portion in the land. Ki'im lahodia imheim ra'ui lamalchut, but simply to verify, are they worthy of kingship? Ulisrara imlo, are they worthy or not? V'hutra ha'sheila haben. He says, and now we've answered question 2. Remember, question 2 was, what's going on here? And he says, you know what's going on? Yaakov's thinking about his sons and looking at them through the lens of, maybe could be a king, right? Shevet could be kings. And he's confirming or denying, rejecting or accepting different shvatim based on their different characters. Okay, so that at least gives us some type of category for what looks like a mess, right? We could call it future predictions like the Ibn Ezra said, but not like really. We could say it's just a tradition, but there has to be more to it than that, right? We might go with Rashi and the Chizkuni's approach that, was it Rashi and the Malbim's approach, that he just needs to say something. But even if he just needs to say something, we're still our interest is piqued by what he says. And Abarbanel gives us an approach. So we're going to take this approach and we're going to explore it for the next couple minutes. And then we'll pick up next week with where we left off. Okay. The Chizkuni, if you look at source 5b, so he actually also clarifies something interesting in the Psukim. He says, this purpose that the Abarbanel just clarified for us, the purpose of investigating all the sons to find the leader, that's a very specific purpose. And therefore, Asher Yikra Lachem Ba'acharit Hayamim, what will happen to you in the end of days, also actually is referencing a very specific time period, not some vague end of days like Yemot HaMashiach, like Rashi wanted to suggest. And if you look at Chizkuni, he says, it doesn't say Ba'acharit Yamim, it says Ba'acharit HaYamim, the end of the days. So what are the days? Hey Mevuarim Kvar Shekava HaKadosh Baruch Hu LaAvraham. Well, we already have like a period of Yamim that we know about in this time period in history, and that's the 400 years of Galut Mitzrayim, right? The promise of the Brit Bein HaBetarim, that there's going to be a 400-year period. So says the Chizkuni, so at the end of that period, we're going to need a leader. At that point will be a nation. Just like fun fact, Paro is the first person to refer to us as a nation. So we weren't a nation going in, but we are definitely a nation coming out. Paro says, Hinei am b'nei Yisrael rav ve'atzum. It's the first time anyone's called us anything other than a family, right? So here we are, we're a nation, and we have a time clock ticking. Like there's going to be some major national event. It's going to last for 400 years. And at that point, we're going to then really be a nation that's going to have a constitution, a Torah, and a homeland, and we're going to need a leader. That's all that we're going to be missing, okay? So let's now look at the first 4 brachot, because now that we have the Abarbanel's paradigm in our head that we're looking here for a king, the first 4 brachot perfectly fit that paradigm. It's like, oh, why did I even need the Abarbanel's help? I should have noticed this myself. So let's look. I broke them into Shimon and Levi get a joint bracha. So I broke them into 3 boxes. Okay, so Ruvain goes first. Ruvain bechori ata, Ruvain, you're my firstborn. Kochi v'reishit oni, right? My strength and the first of my vigor. Yeter, interesting explanations of that. Yeter se'et v'yeter az. You exceed in rank and you exceed in az, in boldness or honor, it says here. Kachaz kamayim al totar. You are unstable as water. Ki alita mishkevei avicha, because you climbed up on your father's bed. Az chilalta yitzue Allah. And you brought chilul, right? You disgraced me, and yitzui Allah. He climbed up on my bed, Yaakov says at the end, kind of like, oh my God, we say that twice, that's so crazy. Okay, we'll read through all 3 and then we'll spend a minute talking about each one. So Ruvain, I mean, as we're moving on, we can each think of what that feels like to us, but you're my firstborn, my might and first fruit of my vigor. You exceed in rank, you exceed in honor, but you're unstable as water, and you shall excel no longer. You're out. Okay, so we'll talk about what quality Yaakov sees in Reuven, but it's clearly he's being disqualified for the leadership here. Done. Shimon v'Levi achim. Shimon and Levi are brothers. Klei Hamas mecherotehem. Their weapons are tools of Hamas. Not Hamas, the organization, that's spelled with an aleph also, but Hamas, like just, chaos and destruction. Yeah, it's like no such thing as coincidence, right? But yeah. Bisodam al tavo nafshi. Let me not be included, Yaakov says, in their secret council. Bikalam al techad kodi. Let me not be counted in their assembly. Kibeapam hargu ish, because they killed a man in their anger. Uvirtzonam ikru shor. And it says here, maimed an oxen, but at their will, they hamstrung an ox. Arur apam ki az, cursed is their anger because it's fierce. Ve'evratam ki kashata, and their wrath because it's kashe, it's tough. Achalkein beYaakov va'afitzein beYisrael. I'll divide them in Yaakov and I will scatter them in Yisrael. Okay, also not a good connotation. Again, just at like a simple glance, it's like, you're not going to be the leaders, like you're out. Okay, remember, Barbanel's thing is, we're trying to find the leader. Yehuda atayoducha achecha. And we already know it's going to be Yehuda, so we could read this one kind of, quickly. And we're not going to focus on Yehuda for tonight for sure, but Yehuda atayoducha achecha. Yehuda, your brothers will praise you, acknowledge you. Yadcha ba'oref oivecha, your hands will be on the nape of your enemies' necks. Your father's sons will bow to you. Yeah, it already sounds good. Okay, Gur Aryeh Yehuda. Yehuda is like a lion cub. Alita, you've risen above the destruction of my sons. Kara Ravatz Aryeh, he crouches like a lion. Ukulavi mi yakimenu, and like a lion. It says here, the king of beasts. Who dares rouse him? I like that translation actually. Lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda. The scepter will not depart from Yehuda. Umechokek mi bein raglav, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Ki yavo Shiloh velo yikat amin. Shiloh, again, the words are, there's a lot of parshanut here, but he will get the tribute, the taxes that are coming to him, and the praise of the people will be his. Osri la gefen iro, we said this. Uvilasreka bini atono. What does it say here in English? He tethers his donkey, we'll go keep it clean here, to a vine. His donkey's full to a choice vine. Kibes bayayin l'busho, he washes his clothing in wine. Uvidam anavim suta, he washes his, it's like meant to be luxurious. You know what I mean? I wouldn't want to wash my robe in wine. That's a terrible idea. But, I have wine free flowing like some people have water. I'm washing my clothes in wine. That's like the kind of the connotation. Chachlili einayim yayin, his eyes are darker than wine. Uleven shinayim mechalab, and his teeth are whiter than milk. Again, I don't understand every single word without the help of our Mefarshim, but it's definitely a bracha. Okay, definitely a good one. And we know from context that Yehuda is going to get the kingship. So it's like clear almost with now the Abarbanel in mind that it's like he's going through them one by one. Ruvain, no. Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, could be. Okay, again, we're going to get through the end and he's still going to pick Yehuda. And we'll ask that question momentarily, but let's spend, what time do we end? Okay, we'll spend like a minute on Ruvain, a minute on Shimon and Levi, and then we'll, Okay, so let's we'll spend 2 minutes on Ruvain and 2 minutes on Shimon and Levi. Okay, so we'll see how we go. Okay, so let's go through each of Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi like for a second, and let's see why they end up, we read it, we got the feeling, we got the vibe. They're not going to be leaders. But let's see exactly what might be bothering Yaakov about them. So I thought this piece from Rav Hirsch. I teach this section of the Chumash every year to my 9th grade students, and I never get to the brachos of Yaakov, but I get to the personalities of Ruvain and Shimon and Levi and Yehuda and Yosef and Binyamin a little bit. They're the main characters in the story here, and I just give my students this one piece from Rav Hirsch and be like, all right, guys, the year's done. Like, we're good. Okay, the Ruvain part of the year. So let's see what Rav Hirsch has to say. It's a beautiful piece. He says, where's Yaakov's disappointment in Ruvain coming from? So Rav Hirsch says, as the firstborn, you have the calling to be the Nasi of your brothers. In other words, the default leadership is supposed to go to the Bechor. That's why there's a whole thing of the Bechor and the Bechorah and the double inheritance. And now, if anyone is thinking like, I'm a firstborn, 0 Bechors in the whole Tanakh ever actually received the Bechorah, right? But the default is supposed to be the firstborn. And then it works out 0 times in Tanakh. And there's a lesson there that we don't go with.
I don't think it's the default. I think that was the time. So the Tanakh comes to tell us I'm going against the tide.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's what I mean by default, meaning the reason the Bechor was assumed to get the Bechorah is because I think the presumption was, they're going to be the most responsible and they're going to have the character. I hear what you're saying, meaning that's just what was done and now we're changing it up.
Right.
Okay, I'm willing to go along with that. Even in halacha, we have that concept of pishnayim, but it's an ideal that seems to, now in regular families, Bechors often got the Bechorah.
No, you're right. It's true. So there is something to it that it's not just that was the time, because it's always been that way. I mean, I know that when my grandparents died, my dad has a sister. He actually signed something.
Oh, interesting.
To give up the Kishnayim and
right. Split it in two. Yeah.
It is a thing.
No, it's an interesting thing. And then there's sort of like this underlying, almost like this big message of, well, you don't just get something because when you're born, that's just kind of silly. You have to earn what you get, which is why it doesn't ever work, which is very interesting. So Rav Hirsch says, Yaakov turns to Ruvain and says, as the firstborn, you have the calling. This was like yours for the taking to be the Nasi of your brothers, the head and leader of the family. And therefore, too, to receive a greater portion of material power. You need the pishnayim of the inheritance to go along with the responsibility of the leadership, because there's, it's a privilege and a responsibility. You get a reward for taking on that responsibility, so that the material foundation for the spiritual leadership may not be wanted. We can't have the guy starving on the street and then being the spiritual leader, right? So you get the pishnayim, this was yours for the taking. Now, Rav Hirsch now stops speaking in the voice of Yaakov and he speaks in his own voice. And he says, it is to be regretted that the root pachaz kamayim, which we translated as unstable as water, Rav Hirsch loves root words, shorashim. This is what he loves, etymology and words that are linguistically related to other words. He says it's really regrettable that the root pachaz does not occur more frequently. Like, we don't have a lot to compare it to figure out what it really means. That should say shoftim in the parentheses. I don't know why it says shortim. But from Anashim Reikim Upochazim, we do have one occurrence of Pachaz in Sefer Shoftim. We can see that it means some shortcoming in character. They were Reikim, they were empty, there was something negative about them, they were flawed Upochazim. There's something bad. We don't know exactly what it means, but something bad. But we still do not know exactly which shortcoming. But here, says Rav Hirsch, unfortunately, it is compared to water. There's hardly anything else that lends itself to such a variety of qualities as water. Water has but we know it's got to be something bad about water. So what we know is something that can describe water, which is everything, because water is eligible for so many descriptions, but it's something negative. So it's a negative thing about water. That's how we're going to try to understand it. And so he gives a few options. Water has no internal stability, hence it could mean unstable as water. Water always flows downward to the lowest level, strives after lowness. Very interesting. But as nevertheless, Yaakov says here, Ruvain, you are the most precious gem in my treasury. Kochi v'reshit oni. But for the leadership of the family, you are not qualified. For that, one must be az. You have to be bold, may not be moved by soft, flattering winds, nor by stormy hurricanes. You must have strong inner fitness and not be unstable like water. So there are a lot of good things you could say about water, but it's very fluid. That obviously that's like what water is. And like that fluidity is too susceptible to change. And you have to be a little more Oz, says Yaakov, if you're going to be the king. You can't be like so fluid. You can't be so susceptible to influence and to change. Flattening wind, hurricane storms, everything makes water move. You can't, you have to stand for something if you're going to be the leader. And so Ruvain, like, this is not going to be for you. And we see this instability. We're not, again, it's not a 12-part series, so we can't spend all night on Ruvain. But we do, if we reflect back on the story of Ruvain, we do see that instability play itself out in a few very key scenes. One scene is the one that Yaakov mentions when Ruvain messes with his father's sleeping arrangements, whether you want to go with Pshat or the Midrash, right? Ruvain, and we'll tie these three together in a minute, but he interferes with where his father is going to sleep or who his father is going to sleep with. And that's number one. Number two, he tries to save Yosef by throwing him in a pit. Okay, well, again, we'll tie these all in together in a second. And number three, later in the story, when Binyamin's life is at stake, Ruvain says, no problem, I got this. If I don't bring him back, you can kill my two sons. Okay, no, those are Yaakov's grandsons. It's like a terrible offer, right? So the thing that we find, if you had me ever for 9th grade Flemish, you know this already. But the thing we find about Ruvain is that he has good intentions, but he has terrible execution. Every single one of those stories. If you're upset about the way your father's treating Leah, you don't sneak into your father's room and mess with his private, intimate life. That's just not okay. And if you want to save Yosef, be a little Oz, stand up and say, guys, we're not doing anything to Yosef. I'm going to sneak back later. What? It's a terrible plan. And it fails because it's a bad plan. And if you want to stand up for Binyamin, so take a stand. Don't make an offer that's obviously meaningless. Nobody's going to kill your two sons. They're Yaakov's grandsons. So there's like, Ruvain's heart is in the right place, but his execution is poor. And his plans fail because they're impetuous. They're fluid. They're really bad. They're not Oz. He doesn't stand up for anything ever. He doesn't ever just confront and say, no, we're not letting this happen on my watch, right? And a leader needs a little bit of that. So Ruvain's not fit for leadership. And it's interesting, Rashi in source 7b here points out that Ruvain actually lost a lot more than we thought. Rashi says, Yeter se'et v'yeter az, ra'ui hayita lihiyot yeter alachecha bekihuna, right? The Kohanim are nosei kapayim, they lift their hands. So Yeter se'et, says Rashi, meant he would have been the Kohen. We knew he would have been the Bechor, he was the firstborn. So he loses the kahuna to Levi, and Yeter az, you were like the best of my az, of my boldness, Bimalchut. He also would have been the Melech. Ruvain had the capacity, right? He was set up to be the Bechor, the Kohen, and the Melech. And he loses the Bechorah to Yosef, and he loses the kahuna to Levi, and he loses the Malchut to Yehuda. So he's like three strikes, okay? 3-time loser a little bit with Ruvain, which is a little sad. Okay, so Ruvain is out. Let's look at Shimon and Levi for a couple minutes. So we'll turn back to Rav Hirsch because also says it so beautifully. Rav Hirsch is very kind to the brothers here. Like if I were interpreting these brachot on my own, I would be like, oh, he's killing them here, Yaakov. He's like, Ruvain, you're a disappointment. But Rav Hirsch says, no, you're my greatest treasure in my treasury. You're just not really going to be a good king, right? Rav Hirsch is very kind. We'll see that here in Shimon and Levi also. In Shimon and Levi's characters, a trait was prominent, which really would quite specially have qualified them to be placed at the head of the future nation. Oh, 1 second, says Rav Hirsch. Shimon and Levi actually have a quality that works maybe in their favor to be the king. They were achim. They were brothers. Now, they were all brothers, but why are they described uniquely as brothers? So there are a lot of ways to answer that question, but I really like what Rav Hirsch says here. They had the feeling of communal brotherhood developed to a high degree, which, completely free from egoism, made them feel affected by any wrong done to the least important member of the family circle as if it had been done to themselves. Their sense of brotherhood within their own community, like you mess with anyone in my community and I feel the pain. That's how there's overdeveloped sense of kinship and community and brotherhood with the rest of their family. That's a very good quality to really care for your people, to really feel their pain as a leader. Says Rav Hirsch, this is a very good quality for kingship. Oh, okay, good. And the Midrash points it out. Yeah, they acted like brothers to Dinah, but not so much to Yosef. Yeah, good. Accordingly, Shimon and Levi would have indeed the right dispositions and feelings for leadership, but the means and ways they adopt are objectionable. So even in the cases where they act like brothers to Dinah, the way they do it is terrible. They're violent. They destroy, they decimate and trick an entire city. And it's not the only thing they do. We'll give them a few bullet points in a minute. Therefore, my will may not enter their council. That is, their decisions may never decide the nation's actions. I can't let them be like the deciding vote for anything, because like they're not, can't trust them. They care, but like in their care, they go too far. It's like too much care. Like, okay, chill a little bit. Their council may never represent the will of the nation. They are unfit for leadership. More, as leaders of the nation, they would constitute a danger. It's great to care, but that you don't want these two on the throne, either of them. I love this line. Whereas Reuven had too little self-confidence, in them the consciousness of their own power and strength was too high, and where it was a matter of the general welfare was ruthless and knew no bounds. Because they cared so much, there's no limit to what they would do to protect their brothers. Like, okay, they really crossed the line because they had no boundaries. They didn't feel compelled to be, bound by any sense of boundary or law. Well, the king, it's great that he cares for his people, but he has to be bound by something. He can't just do whatever he wants in the name of care for his people. There has to be a sense of boundary. And so they have none. And again, where we see their brotherhood be used in the wrong way, it's according to the Midrash, it's Shimon who says to Levi, here comes Yosef the dreamer, let's throw him in a pit and kill him. Okay, so I'm glad you're protecting, I don't know who they're protecting, Reuven, but you can't kill your brother, or it's, that's like no boundary. And then this is interesting, and so I put the Rashis in here, source 9a and b. There are 2 times in Rashi where he mentions that Yaakov doesn't want his name associated with a particular person. 1, Zimri from the tribe of Shimon, and 2, Korach from the tribe of Levi. So there's going to be a person in the future from both Shimon and Levi where Yaakov says, do me a favor, when you mention him, just please leave me out of it. Yeah, and the Korach one's the really famous one, but the same thing happens with Zimri from the tribe of Shimon. Yaakov says, and that's the meaning, says Rashi, of Bisodam al tavo nafshi. In the bracha to Shimon and Levi, Yaakov says, I don't want to be in their crew. He doesn't even want to be mentioned in conjunction with them because it's upsetting to Yaakov the way they act. Now we know down the line, Levi's going to redeem himself and Shimon is not. Shimon's really not. So I don't want to give anything away, but it will be interesting to compare Yaakov's bracha to Shimon, Moshe's bracha to Shimon. So we have Reuven with a leadership position as the oldest, but no leadership qualities. And then we have Shimon and Levi with possible leadership qualities, but they don't know how to channel them. So no, no, and no. Although I will say, and just we'll read source time quickly and then we'll close it up for tonight, that Yaakov does recognize that Shimon and Levi do have some good qualities. He's not totally turned off of Shimon and Levi's qualities. So this is such a beautiful piece. Rav Hirsch says, but in Galut, where the pressure of our fate bows everything down and the nation itself torn asunder, there the danger lies that all feelings of one's own importance becomes lost. When we live not in our own homeland, sometimes we lose our sense of self. And the sense of oppression kills all spiritual force and energy. That even the wandering Jew peddling through Europe still looked down on the street boys of the various countries with proud feelings of his own value. It's amazing, says Rav Hirsch, that even in Galut, in Europe, that the wandering Jew could be proud to be Jewish. We were despised by everyone around us. And so being in Galut really, really messes with our sense of pride in our Jewish identity. But that even the wandering Jew, downtrodden and driven all over the world, still keeps the feelings of the importance of his own person and the sense of belonging to his own people. For that, Achal came to Yaakov. I'll scatter Shimon and Levi amongst the Jewish people. It was of the greatest benefit. It's an amazing piece, that the tribes of Shimon and Levi were scattered amongst the other tribes, which had the natural result that when the state collapsed, not like the modern state, but like the, Korban Beit HaMikdash, and the nation scattered in all directions, in this dispersion, Shimonites and Levites would be found everywhere, who with their fiery and proud dispositions would keep alive the energy and the courage, the fire and the noble Jewish pride of the Jewish spirit, outliving the loss of state. We need the fire of Shimon and Levi. It can burn us. And that's why when we're in our own homelands, afit same the Yaakov, I got to scatter them around. I can't let them be together when we're strong because they're going to ruin it because their fire is, but when we're dispersed, we need that fire and we need that dispersion. Like we need to feel that pride that Shimon and Levi felt. We need to feel that sense of belonging and brotherhood, an unbelievable piece. And Yaakov recognizes that. He says, afit same Yaakov achalkeim Yisrael. I will scatter them when we're whole because I don't want them to, can't let like the two bad kids sit together in class, God forbid. But, it's not so bad to have those kids with a lot of extra energy at color war. Like there's a time and a place. But I'm serious, there's a time and a place. And Yaakov sees it. He knows the time and he knows the place. And he says, okay, pause. I'll put you on hold. And I promise the time will come where exactly what you bring to the table is what's needed, which is a really beautiful idea. Okay, and so they're disqualified with an asterisk because we're going to like them again later, right, as we just read, but it's not enough to qualify them as leaders, and so Yehuda is going to get the malchut. And we said we're not going to talk about Yehuda tonight, but I'll ask one last question. So, yeah.
No commentary had anything good to say before
No, there's so much good stuff to say, but that's a 12-part series. Yeah, no, I couldn't pick. There's so much good stuff. Shimon and Levi are fascinating. If we want to explore them more, we can totally choose to do that. Like I'm open. Exactly. Something good to say. I know. No, there's other good stuff. That's a beauty. And I only read it on your own because there's more. I just wanted to pick. It's a really beautiful piece. Okay, so we got to Yehuda and he's the Melech. So why does Yaakov keep going? Why does he go through Yisachar's? Like we picked the king. Okay, maybe there's something right. Yehuda, for now, you're the king. You're my pick, but I'm going to put you in reserve. Yeah, so it maybe, and he does. He finds Yosef, and he. Okay. Yeah. It's been a really long time. Yeah. So, but it's an interesting thing. If Abarbanel's right, and we're on a search here for a leader, it seemed like Yaakov was all in with Yehuda.
But also there's the base that you're waiting for. He might be very happy with him and thinking, oh, well, if something happens to him, I really
need to back up. Yeah. And by the way, the reality ends up being that there's more than just king as a leadership position. There's the kahuna, and that's going to be Levi, and there's the Bechora, which is going to be Yosef. So it may one thing at a time. King. Okay, so now one last, I'm sorry with my obsession with Rav Hirsch tonight, but he has a lot of good things to say. Let's read this last piece because I think it's just a beautiful way to end for now. He says, he goes back to this question of the original purpose, like what's Yaakov doing here? And he agrees actually with the Abarbanel that there is a search here for leader. He agrees. He reads it the same way. He says, I give Abarbanel the credit because he came much before Rav Hirsch. So he gets the credit for the whole leadership angle. But Rav Hirsch totally agrees. But he says, but there's also a broader message going on here. There's more than just a search for leader. And if it was just a search for leader, maybe he would have stopped at Yehuda. But there's also something broader going on. He tells his sons, be all taken up with that which is common to you all. Place yourselves all on one common footing. All of you together give yourselves up to your one purpose in life, meaning unity. We know from what follows that Yaakov was not having in mind the uniformity of his sons, but was thinking of them in their characteristic diversity. Materially, you are Bnei Yaakov, you're a powerless minority. But because you are a powerless minority, hikabsu, gather together, keep together, grow together. Do not split up into parties. In kibbutz, in unity lies your strength. And Shimu b'nei Yaakov, listen, only by one thing can the weakest material minority obtain the victory over the strongest majority. Ooh, this is such good timing with Hanukkah. And that is spirit, mind. It is Shimu. It is by giving yourselves up to spirituality. Hence, Shimu b'nei Yaakov, have an ear, listen for it, get understanding for the spiritual, thirst for it, drink deeply, absorb it. Drinking out of the Jewish well of spirituality and harmoniously keeping together, that is the oldest legacy of our dying father. And so Rav Hirsch says, it's not only a question of who will lead, because that sets someone apart, but it's really more about what can each tribe bring to the table, because we're going to be a big nation, and every tribe is going to have its character, like we just saw with Shimon and Levi. There's a character that they have. Is it always good? No. Is it suitable for the ultimate leadership role? No. But every tribe is going to bring something to the table. And our goal is going to be unity without uniformity. Our goal, and this is like a classic Rav Hirsch idea, our goal is going to be to allow each tribe to bring its unique character and shine in the greater scheme of the nation. And that's piece one of Yaakov's advice. And then piece two is, guys, you're not going to win on material terms. Like, that's not your tool. That's not your strength, right? This is straight from Zechariah, right? Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki'im beruchi. Your strength is in your spirit. And so if I can give you two pieces of advice, says Yaakov, it's stick together, but don't lose yourselves in the sticking together. Don't confuse unity and uniformity. Don't lose yourself. Each of you brings something so special. And if you can bring that special trait and you can stick together through the hard times, and you can remember that your greatest weapon is your spiritual affiliation and devotion to Hashem, then you'll make it through history. And I think that's Yaakov's message for Acharit Hayamin, because here we are. We're not at the end of days with a capital T, but we're in many later days than Yaakov was speaking. And the message that he shared really is the message that has endured for thousands of years of Jewish history. Our strength is in our unity and in our spirituality. And I think that piece of Rav Hirsch really nailed it. So for that, we'll end for now. I'm so happy to take questions. And then we'll resume next week. Yeah. Yeah. Until the times of after the Chet HaEgel, when Levi distinguishes itself by not serving the idol or ever serving idols, and Levi ends up jumping to the highest of heights. And I know I referenced it a minute ago. I said we'll have to look at Moshe's bracha to Shimon. Spoiler alert: Moshe doesn't give a bracha to Shimon. He skips him entirely because Shimon never redeems himself. So there's nothing to look at. Shimon's just kind of like a disappointment all along, other than these nice things we said about him. Shimon just doesn't ever really do anything great with his character, but Levi really does. So then there's a huge split. Levi's at the top and Shimon is like at the bottom. Yeah, Levi definitely singled out as the teachers. They weren't subject to slavery, which is so interesting. It says a lot about Paro in a way, because they weren't really distinct necessarily in the Jewish community, but Paro gave them like a free pass, which means maybe they were already the teachers and Paro maybe had respect for religious leadership or something like that. But yeah, that's true. That even before Chet HaEgel and Mitzrayim, they had distinguished themselves. It's a good point.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Hey.